Chapter 1. The Blood Oath. The stench of death clung to the battlefield like a curse, thick and cloying. Smoke curled into the twilight sky, mingling with the last embers of a once mighty army. What remained of Count Alaric von Karstein's forces now fled through the blasted terrain, leaving behind shattered banners and broken bodies. Captain Gregor Von Drach stood among the ruins, his blackened armor rent and caked with blood, both his own and that of his foes. His sword, a cruel ancient thing of Sylvania's darkest forges, dripped with the lifeblood of the Imperial soldiers he had cut down. Even now, in the moment of retreat, his mind was unclouded, unyielding. The fight was not yet done. Gregor turned to the towering figure before him. Count Alaric von Karstein, the last hope of his dwindling bloodline. The vampire lord's crimson eyes burned like coals, his regal features untouched by fear, yet Gregor could sense the weight of the night pressing down upon him. Even the undead could know despair, and tonight it ran thick in their veins. "This battle is lost," Alaric admitted, his voice carrying the smooth authority of one born to rule. "We are outnumbered, outmatched. Schwarzburg Keep is our last sanctuary." Gregor knelt, his gauntlet scraping against the broken stone of the battlefield. "Then I will buy you the time you need, my lord." Alaric's gaze hardened. "You understand what you are offering, Gregor? If you remain, you will not leave Schwarzburg alive." Gregor's lips twisted into the ghost of a smile. "I was not alive when you found me, my count. I have no illusions of salvation. My duty is to you." For a moment the count was silent. Then, stepping forward, he placed a cold hand upon Gregor's shoulder. The gesture was rare among their kind, almost human. "You have ever been my sword and my shield, Gregor von Drach," Alaric said. "Now you shall be my rampart." Gregor met his lord's gaze, unwavering. "I swear it, upon my blood, upon my unlife, I will hold Schwarzburg." The oath settled between them, heavy as the grave. Behind them, the Imperial war horns called across the field, a sound of triumph and relentless pursuit. The Grand Marshal of the Empire, Hendrik von Rauken, would not rest until Sylvania's horrors were purged from the land. His army, bolstered by zealous witch hunters and Sigmarite priests, would march upon Schwarzburg by dawn. Gregor rose to his feet. "Go, my lord. Reach the mountains. I will hold the gate." Alaric lingered a moment longer before nodding. Without another word he turned, vanishing into the mists with the remnants of his court. The retreat had begun. Gregor watched them fade into the darkness before turning to what remained of his own warriors. Undead knights, spectral wraiths, and the soulless remnants of mortal mercenaries who had sold their service to the von Karsteins, the defenders of Schwarzburg Keep. Witness the first war. The wind howled across the field, carrying the whispers of the dead. Gregor took a final breath of the cold night air and faced the oncoming storm. The Empire was coming, and he would be waiting. Chapter 2. The Hunter's Wrath. The drums of war rolled across the land like distant thunder, echoing through the broken valleys of Sylvania. Beneath the pale light of Manslieb and Morslieb, a tide of steel and fire surged toward Schwarzburg Keep, the might of the Empire, relentless and unyielding. At the head of this host, astride a war horse clad in gilded barding, rode Grand Marshal Hendrik von Rauken, his crimson cloak billowing in the cold night air. His armor, chased with sigils of Sigmar and the twin-tailed comet, gleamed in the flickering torchlight of his vanguard. He was a veteran of 100 battles, a man who had sworn his life to the destruction of the undead menace that plagued the old world. His eyes, sharp as a hunting hawk's, fixed upon the shadowed silhouette of Schwarzburg in the distance. The keep was ancient, its walls blackened by time and magic, perched like a corpse upon the jagged cliffs. a fortress of the night, now standing as the last defiant bastion of the damned. Beside him rode witch-hunter Otto Halbrecht, clad in a long coat of hardened leather, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. A brace of silvered pistols hung from his belt, and a rune-etched stake rested across his saddle. His cold gaze swept the battlefield, searching for signs of the unnatural. "They will not surrender," Halbrecht said, his voice like dry parchment. "Vampires do not fear death, for they are already beyond it." Von Rochen did not look at him. "Then we shall remind them that even the dead can be destroyed." Behind them, the Empire's great army stretched in perfect formation, banners rippling in the night breeze. Rank upon rank of state troops, their halberds and pikes gleaming, stood ready for battle. Cannon crews wheeled their artillery into position, and squads of handgunners loaded silver-shot rounds into their weapons. At the heart of the host, their armor reflecting the torchlight, rode the Reiksguard knights, the Emperor's finest warriors, their steel lances held high. Their commander, Baron Ludwig Faust, a grizzled veteran of the vampire wars, clenched the reins of his destrier and cast a grim look at the keep ahead. To the rear, under the banners of the cult of Sigmar, a contingent of warrior priests gathered in prayer. Clad in heavy robes and burnished plate, they clutched their sacred hammers and recited the litanies of purification. Lector Marcus Feuerbach, an aged but unshaken zealot, raised his voice in a booming sermon. "By Sigmar's will, we bring his light to this accursed land. The undead defile all that is sacred, but tonight the righteous shall cleanse their filth with fire and faith." A cheer rose from the soldiers, and the warrior priests struck their warhammers against their shields in unison. Von Rochen watched them with measured patience. He had no love for zealots, but he would not deny their effectiveness against the horrors of Sylvania. His task was not merely war, but extermination, the total destruction of von Karstein's last remnants. As the army approached Schwarzburg's outer walls, the engineers and sappers moved forward, their torches flickering in the mist. Trebuchets and cannons were positioned atop makeshift platforms, their crews working tirelessly to prepare for the coming barrage. Von Rochen turned to Halbrecht. "Send your hunters forward. I want eyes inside the walls. If there are weaknesses, I will know of them before sunrise." Halbrecht gave a curt nod and gestured to his retinue. The witch hunters of Altorf, grim-faced men and women draped in sigils of the Order, rode ahead, disappearing into the night. From the battlements of Schwarzburg, unseen eyes watched their every move. The defenders did not flinch at the size of the approaching army, nor at the banners of Sigmar's might. They had seen such forces before. They had watched 1,000 men march against the undead, believing they could bring an end to the night. And yet the night endured. Inside the keep, Captain Gregor Von Drach stood upon the walls, his crimson cloak billowing in the night wind. His gauntleted hand rested on the hilt of his blackened longsword. He did not smile, nor did he frown. He simply waited. The Grand Marshal's army had come. The siege of Schwarzburg had begun. Chapter 3. The Wailing Keep. The wind howled through the towers of Schwarzburg Keep, carrying with it the whispers of the dead. The fortress had stood for centuries, its foundations sunk deep into the accursed bedrock of Sylvania. Legends told of the horrors buried beneath its halls, of the wailing spirits that clung to its stones like parasites, and of the nameless things that stalked its dungeons. To the men of the Empire, it was a place of nightmares. To Captain Gregor Von Drach, it was home. Gregor stood atop the highest battlement, his crimson cloak stirring in the wind. Below him, his forces gathered in the broken courtyards and shadowed halls, preparing for the battle to come. He knew that Schwarzburg could not hold indefinitely, but it did not have to. It needed only to endure long enough for Count Alaric to escape into the mountains. He turned his cold, unblinking gaze upon the warriors he had left. Beneath the pale light of the twin moons, ranks of skeletal soldiers stood motionless, their rusted blades clutched in bony hands. Hollow eye sockets glowed with the dim green fire of necromantic will, their presence an eerie contrast to the flickering torches that dotted the walls. Among them, towering and clad in ancient Baroque armor, were the Grave Guard, the undying elite of the von Karstein legions. Their greatswords, blackened with age, gleamed faintly under the moonlight, and their helms bore the insignia of long-dead noble houses. These warriors had been kings and knights once. Now they were nothing but instruments of war. Gregor moved through the ranks, silent as the grave, until he came to the ruined western courtyard. There, ghouls hunched in the darkness, their pallid flesh twitching with unnatural hunger. These wretched creatures had once been men, cannibals and outcasts who had long since abandoned their humanity. Their red eyes gleamed in the torchlight. They did not fear him, but they knew better than to challenge him. He surveyed the defenders with a soldier's eye. The undead would not falter, but there were others among them who still clung to life. The mortal mercenaries, those few men who had sold their swords to the von Karsteins for gold, or out of desperation, lingered near the walls, whispering among themselves. Their armor was tarnished, their faces gaunt from too many sleepless nights in Sylvania's cursed lands. Unlike the undead, they knew fear. Gregor approached them, his expression unreadable. At his approach they straightened, but their hands trembled on the hilts of their weapons. One of them, a grizzled veteran named Mathis Lothar, stepped forward. His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of doubt behind his eyes. "My lord." "The men speak of leaving," he said carefully. "They say this keep is doomed, that the Empire's guns will turn these walls to dust." Gregor regarded him for a long moment. "They are correct," he said at last. Lothar blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Then you will allow us to leave?" Gregor's gauntleted fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. The truth was bitter, but he would not speak falsehoods to the living. "You may leave," Gregor said evenly. "But know this, there is nowhere to run. The forests are filled with the Empire's outriders. The mountains are treacherous. And should you survive both, the villagers of Stirland will burn you alive as traitors." Silence fell over the mercenaries. Some glanced at each other, uncertain. Rieger took a step closer, his gaze cold and unwavering. "Stay, and you will die. But you will die as warriors. Flee, and you will die as cowards." Lothar swallowed hard. Behind him, the others shifted uneasily, but none moved toward the gates. They had made their choice. Gregor turned away. It was enough. The defenses of Schwarzburg. Gregor ascended the battlements once more and surveyed the defenses of the keep. Schwarzburg was ancient, its walls thick and weathered, but not unbreakable. The Empire had cannons, mortars, and trebuchets. The stones would not hold forever. But Schwarzburg had other defenses. Beneath the keep, the catacombs were filled with forgotten dead, waiting only for the right command to rise once more. The crypts, lined with black iron gates, had held creatures long thought buried by time, and in the highest tower, Adelheid the Pale, the necromancer, prepared her dark rituals, calling upon powers even Gregor dared not name. Schwarzburg would not be an easy prize. As Gregor looked out over the horizon, he saw the Empire's torches in the distance, a sea of fire stretching toward the keep. The Grand Marshal's siege lines were forming, his cannons being positioned, his priests chanting their blessings. The battle would begin soon. Gregor closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the final quiet before the storm. Then he opened them again, and his sword slid from its sheath with a whisper of steel. The hunters had come. Let them break themselves against the walls of the damned. Chapter 4. The First Assault. The stillness of the night shattered with the roar of gunpowder. The Empire's first assault had begun. From the trenches beyond Schwarzburg's ruined outer walls, a force of Imperial militia and handgunners surged forward, torches and blades gleaming in the moonlight. The Grand Marshal had not yet committed his full strength. This was a test, a probing attack meant to expose the keep's weaknesses. But even the weakest thrust, if left unanswered, could find a gap in the armor. Gregor Von Drach stood upon the battlements, watching them come. His expression did not change, nor did his grip tighten on his blade. He had seen this strategy before, fought it a dozen times over in the endless wars against the Empire. They believed Schwarzburg weak. They would soon learn otherwise. The first wave reached the base of the walls. The handgunners knelt, their powder-blackened fingers steady as they aimed their weapons at the keep's murder holes and arrow slits. Fire. The night erupted with the crack of gunfire. Bullets whined through the air, striking stone and steel. A few found their mark. Several skeletal archers crumbled as their bones were shattered by lead shot. A ghoul perched atop the ramparts shrieked as a bullet punched through its eye socket. Gregor did not flinch. These were the sacrifices war demanded. Return fire. At his command, the undead defenders unleashed their counterattack. From the walls, skeleton archers loosed their black-feathered arrows, their motions mechanical and unfeeling. The bolts rained down upon the Empire's skirmishers, striking unarmored flesh. Gregor did not waste time with further volleys. The enemy had come too close to be driven back with arrows alone. It was time for steel and slaughter. The counterattack. Gregor raised his blade high, the ancient weapon glistening with unnatural cold. Below, the gates of Schwarzburg groaned open, spilling forth a tide of death. The Whites of Schwarzburg, his elite warriors, charged into the fray. Tall and clad in Baroque armor blackened by age, the Grave Guard waded into the Imperial militia with the slow, methodical grace of warriors who had long since forgotten fear. Their greatswords, massive and wickedly sharp, cleaved through flesh and steel alike. One militia sergeant raised his halberd in defiance, only for Gregor himself to cut him down, his black blade shearing through the man's collarbone in a single brutal strike. The man staggered back, choking on his own blood, before collapsing at the vampire's feet. The militia broke almost immediately. Panic set in as the soldiers saw their comrades hacked apart by the relentless advance of the undead. The handgunners tried to fall back, their commanders barking orders to reload, but the ghouls were already among them. With inhuman speed, the pale-skinned monsters scrambled over the bodies of the fallen, their clawed hands lashing out. A gunner screamed as a ghoul latched onto him, tearing out his throat with jagged teeth. Another was dragged into the mud, his body twitching as the creatures feasted. The Empire's first attack had turned into a massacre. The capture of Ludwig Faust. Amid the slaughter, Gregor's keen gaze locked onto a single Imperial officer, desperately fighting to hold the line, a knight clad in the black and silver of the Reichsguard, his plumed helm smeared with blood and mud. Lieutenant Ludwig Faust. Gregor had heard his name whispered among the survivors of past battles, a skilled warrior, a rising commander in the Grand Marshal's army. If there was a chance to extract information, this was the man to take. With inhuman speed, Gregor descended upon him. Faust barely had time to react before the vampire was upon him. He blocked Gregor's first strike, his long sword flashing in the torchlight, but the force of the impact sent him stumbling backward. Gregor did not relent. He struck again and again, his blackened blade moving too fast for any mortal to counter. Faust's defense shattered. Gregor disarmed him with a vicious strike, sending his sword spinning into the dirt. Before the knight could recover, a mailed fist crashed into his face, snapping his head back. Faust collapsed, half-conscious and bleeding, as the battle raged around him. Gregor motioned to two of his grave guard. "Take him." Without a word, the undead warriors seized Faust's arms, dragging him back toward the keep. Gregor cast one last glance at the battlefield. The Empire's forces were in full retreat, leaving their dead behind. The first wave had been repelled, but this was only the beginning. Interrogation in the dark. Back within the chill depths of Schwarzburg, Gregor stood before the bound and beaten Ludwig Faust. The knight's face was bruised, his lips split, but his eyes still burned with defiance. "You will gain nothing from me, monster," Faust spat, his breath ragged. Gregor stepped closer, his pale features unreadable. "You misunderstand, Faust. I do not seek confessions or cowardly bargains. I seek knowledge." Faust clenched his jaw, refusing to speak. Gregor sighed, almost disappointed. "Very well. We shall do this the old way." He motioned, and Adelheid the Pale stepped forward, her skeletal fingers crackling with necromantic energy. The air in the chamber grew thick with deathly chill. Faust shuddered, his resolve flickering for the first time. Gregor leaned in, his voice a whisper of ice. "Tell me, Faust, how many cannons does your Grand Marshal bring? Where does he plan his first true assault?" The knight gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his brow. Gregor smiled, revealing his fangs. "One way or another you will answer." And in the depths of Schwarzburg, beneath the weight of 1,000 dead souls, the first screams began. Chapter 5. Whispers of the Dead. The air inside Schwarzburg Keep was thick with dust and the weight of centuries. Cold torches burned with eerie green witchlight, casting long shadows that twisted across the stone walls. Gregor Von Drach strode through the corridors like a spectre, his crimson cloak trailing behind him as he descended into the lower crypt. Here, beneath the fortress, where the dead outnumbered the living, Adelheid the Pale made her sanctum. The necromancer was waiting for him. She stood in the center of a ritual circle, etched with runes long forgotten by mortal scholars. The air shimmered with necrotic energy, the whispered voices of the damned flickering through the chamber like wind through a graveyard. Adelheid was not beautiful, she was gaunt, with skin like aged parchment stretched thin over delicate bones. Her eyes, sunken and colorless, bore the hollow wisdom of one who had gazed too long into the abyss. Gregor did not speak immediately. He had learned long ago to let the dead whisper first. The voices rose and fell, words half-formed, slipping through the veil of death. Gregor could feel them, pressing against his mind, their secrets just beyond reach. At last, Adelheid lifted her hands. The wails faded into silence, leaving only the steady dripping of water from the stone ceiling. "You come to me, Captain," she murmured, her voice dry as old parchment. "You wish to know the fate of Schwarzburg." Gregor's fingers curled around the hilt of his blade. "I already know its fate. It will fall." Adelheid's lip twitched into something resembling a smile. "Then why trouble the dead for answers?" Gregor took a step closer. "Because there is one life that must be spared before the walls crumble." Adelheid's head tilted, her gaze sharpening. "The Count," Gregor nodded. "He must escape, no matter the cost." Adelheid exhaled slowly, then gestured to the walls around them. "Schwarzburg was built on bones, Captain. Its secrets are written in the marrow of the dead. There are paths here that no living man remembers." She turned toward the far wall, where a black iron door loomed, half buried in rubble. Time and neglect had sealed it away, but Gregor could feel the cold power emanating from it, old and patient, like something that had been waiting too long. Adelheid placed a skeletal hand on the door. The air around it rippled, and the whispers of the dead grew frantic. "This passage leads beneath the keep," she said. "Through the old burial tunnels, past the forgotten crypts of those who served the von Karsteins in ages past. It will take the Count into the mountains, beyond the reach of the Empire." Gregor stepped closer. A hidden passage. The Count's salvation. And his own death sentence. The escape of Count Alaric. Time was short. The Empire's torches burned brighter beyond the walls, the drumbeats of war growing louder. Gregor led Count Alaric von Karstein to the crypt's threshold, where his loyal retainers waited in silence. The Count turned to Gregor, his crimson gaze unreadable. "You will not come with us." It was not a question. Gregor bowed his head. "No, my lord. The hunters must believe that you still reside within these walls. I will give them that illusion." Alaric's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. A hesitation, perhaps even regret. He placed a hand upon Gregor's shoulder. "I will not forget this." Gregor knelt, resting his gauntleted fist over his heart. "My life was yours, Count. My death shall be yours as well." Alaric said no more. With a final glance at his captain, he stepped into the darkness of the passage, his retinue following behind him. The iron door closed with a hollow clang, and the air grew colder. Gregor turned away. He would never see his Count again. The final stand. When Gregor emerged from the crypts, the night sky had turned to fire. The Empire's artillery had arrived. From the siege lines beyond the keep, the thunder of cannons shook the earth. Massive black iron bombards, hauled by teams of war horses, were unleashing their fury upon Schwarzburg. Each impact sent shockwaves through the fortress, collapsing towers, shattering walls. The night was alive with the roar of gunpowder, the screams of the damned, the crashing of stone. Gregor strode to the battlements, unfazed by the destruction around him. His unlife was already forfeit. Adelheid joined him, her white robes torn and blood-stained from her dark workings. "The keep will not last the night," she said, almost amused. Gregor drew his sword, its black steel reflecting the firelight. "Then we will make them pay for every stone they take." The last defenders of Schwarzburg assembled behind him. The Grave Guard, their rusted armor clinking, raised their great swords in silence. The skeletal legion stood in perfect ranks, awaiting their master's will. Ghouls and wraiths lurked in the shadows, eyes gleaming with savage hunger. The Empire's horns sounded, signaling the advance of their main force. Gregor raised his blade, pulled the gates, and as the hunters came, Schwarzburg screamed with the voices of the dead. Chapter 6. Steel and Fire. The night sky above Schwarzburg Keep burned with the fire of war. The Empire's great cannons, black iron monstrosities blessed by Sigmar's priests, had been unleashed in full fury. The first shot slammed into the western wall, shattering stone like brittle bone. The battlements groaned under the impact, sending skeletons and wights tumbling into the courtyard below. Another blast tore through the southern tower, reducing it to a heap of blackened rubble. The great fortress, which had stood for centuries, was dying, its ancient defenses no match for the Empire's relentless war machines. Upon the crumbling walls, Captain Gregor Von Drach stood unmoving, his crimson cloak billowing in the storm of debris and fire. He did not flinch. His war was not over. The hunters advanced. From beyond the smoking ruins of the outer walls, the Empire's assault force gathered, preparing to strike. Ranks of halberdiers stood at the ready, their steel gleaming in the torchlight. State troops and Reichsguard knights formed disciplined battle lines, their banners rippling in the night wind. Behind them, the warrior priests of Sigmar raised their warhammers high, chanting litanies of purification, their voices carried by the wind. The witch hunters, clad in dark leather and wide-brimmed hats, watched from horseback, their silver-got pistols glinting. And behind them all, the great artillery batteries continued their barrage, tearing Schwarzburg stone by stone. Gregor's eyes narrowed. The first true assault would come soon. He could see it in their formation, in the way the Reichsguard prepared to charge, in the eager zealotry of the priests and hunters. If Schwarzburg was to fall, he would bleed them for every step they took. Hit-and-run warfare. Gregor turned from the battlements, his cold voice ringing through the ruined keep. "Send in the fell bats." The beastmasters obeyed without question. From the keep's broken towers, swarms of fell bats emerged, their tattered wings blotting out the sky. The creatures screeched as they descended upon the Empire's siege lines, their claws raking through flesh, their fangs sinking into exposed throats. Gregor watched from above as soldiers screamed, flailing their torches in the air. Some managed to bring the creatures down, but many fell to the ground, their faces torn open, their blood staining the frozen earth. Before the Imperials could recover, Gregor raised his gauntleted fist once more. Unleash the wolves. From the ruined forest beyond the walls, the dire wolves came. Massive, skeletal beasts, their glowing eyes burning with malice, emerged from the mists, moving like shadows between the trees. The Empire's pike formations wavered as the wolves surged forward, fangs flashing in the moonlight. The first line of handgunners fired, their bullets tearing into the beasts, but the wolves did not falter. They slammed into the flanks of the Imperials, ripping through armor, tearing men from their saddles, dragging them screaming into the dark. Gregor allowed himself the faintest of smiles. The hunters were not prepared to become the hunted. The Pale Sorcery. Amidst the chaos of battle, Adelheid the Pale stood upon the shattered ramparts, her hands raised to the heavens, her tattered white robes billowing in the wind. The necromancer's lips moved in a whisper, chanting words of power older than the Empire itself. The air around her thickened, shimmering like the heat of a funeral pyre. Below, the Imperial dead began to stir. The corpses of fallen handgunners, their bodies riddled with claw marks and sword wounds, twitched upon the ground. Their fingers clawed at the frozen mud, their eyes snapping open, not with life, but with the cold green glow of undeath. A wounded Empire soldier, barely clinging to life, crawled backward in horror as the corpse of his slain brother slowly rose to its feet, its head lolling at an unnatural angle. "Sigmar, preserve me," the soldier whispered, his breath hitching in terror. The risen dead turned to face their former comrades, their jaws slack, their hands still clutching Imperial swords and halberds. Then, without hesitation, they attacked. The Empire's battle lines dissolved into panic as their own fallen turned against them. Gregor watched it unfold with cold satisfaction. A man who fears death is weak. A man who watches his comrades rise again, wearing the same wounds that killed them, is already broken. Through the smoke and fire, Gregor could see the witch hunters trying to rally the troops, their flintlocks blazing, their voices carrying above the carnage. "Hold your ground. Burn the corpses. They are but puppets of darkness." A risen Reiksguard knight, his breastplate still bearing the sigil of Karl Franz's empire, drove his sword through the witch hunter's throat, silencing him forever. The Empire's first assault had turned into madness, the storm before the siege. Despite the devastation, Gregor knew this was not victory. The Empire was too disciplined, too stubborn to break so easily. They would regroup, adapt. He had bought time, but Schwarzburg's walls were still crumbling, and the true siege had not yet begun. As the smoke of battle cleared, he saw them. Fresh Imperial reinforcements marching forward, their banners rising against the night sky. The Grand Marshal had seen enough. It was time for the final assault. Gregor turned to Adelheid. "They will come in full force at dawn." The necromancer's face remained unreadable. "Then we shall greet them with open graves." Gregor looked toward the horizon, where the first faint traces of dawn began to creep across the sky. Tomorrow Schwarzburg Keep would become a tomb, but it would not be theirs alone. Chapter 7. The Hammer Falls. The Empire's war horns bellowed across the ruined landscape, their deep reverberating call carrying through the smoke-choked air. The echoes of their challenge were met with silence from Schwarzburg Keep, the silence of the dead. Upon his war horse, clad in gleaming plate, Grand Marshal Hendrik von Rocken raised his greatsword high, its blade glinting beneath the first pale light of dawn. The time for testing the keep's defenses was over. No more probing attacks, no more cautious advances. Now came the hammer stroke. "For Sigmar, for the Empire!" Von Drach roared, his voice booming across the ranks of his assembled host. The full weight of the Imperial army surged forward, banners streaming in the wind, steel flashing in the early light. Gregor Von Drach watched from the crumbling battlements, his face expressionless. He had seen such assaults before. Empires rise and empires fall, but death is eternal, and so is war. The breach of the main gate. The Empire's siege guns fired one final earth-shaking barrage. Massive black iron bombards thundered in unison, their cannonballs streaking through the air like comets. Boom. The main gate, already weakened by hours of relentless bombardment, shattered apart in a storm of stone and splinters. A great cloud of dust and debris billowed outward as the ancient defenses gave way. For the first time in centuries, Schwarzburg stood open to its enemies, and through the ruin of the gate, the Reichsguard knights charged. They came as a tide of steel and fury, their armor polished and pristine, their lances leveled, their war horses thundering forward in perfect formation. Each man bore the sigil of the twin-tailed comet, their devotion to Sigmar burning in their hearts. Behind them, ranks of halberdiers and greatswords followed, their boots crashing against the shattered ground. The full might of the Empire was now inside the keep. Gregor did not hesitate. The time for shadows and whispers was over. Now was the time for steel. He drew his blade, the ancient weapon humming with dark power. The blackened steel drank in the light as if it were thirsting for blood. Cut them down, and the dead obeyed. The butchers worked. The Reichsguard met the Graveguard head-on, steel clashing against steel. The elite knights of the Empire, wielding flawless longswords of gilt-forged steel, crashed against the black-armored dead, the air filling with the screech of metal and the howls of the damned. The first knight to reach Gregor swung his sword in a perfect arc, aiming to cleave the vampire's head from his shoulders. Gregor sidestepped with inhuman speed, his blade whipping out in a blur of motion. The knight's head tumbled from his shoulders, blood spraying across the ruined ground. Before the body had even hit the ground, Gregor was already moving again. Another knight lunged, but Gregor caught his blade in his gauntleted hand, wrenching it aside before driving his own sword through the man's breastplate. The knight gasped, eyes wide with shock, before Gregor twisted the blade and tore it free, sending him crumpling into the mud. The third attacker met an even swifter end. Gregor spun, his cloak billowing, and with a single vicious backhand slash, he split the knight from shoulder to hip. 1, 2, 3. Gregor waded through the melee, his movements too fast, too precise. His sword was a blur of black steel and red ruin, cutting down one knight after another. A fourth, a fifth, a sixth. Even among the chaos, he felt the tide turning against him. The Empire's sheer numbers were beginning to overwhelm his forces. The dead did not break, but they could be broken. Gregor saw his Graveguard being pushed back, the silver weapons of the Reichsguard burning through their cursed armor. He saw the Empire's greatswords hacking through his skeletal legions, their Zweihander shattering bone and severing limbs. And then he saw him, the wrath of Sigmar. The warrior priest came forward, wading through the melee with holy fire burning in his eyes. His massive warhammer bore the sacred runes of Sigmar, the head of the weapon glowing with divine energy. Lector Marcus Feuerbach, a zealot, a hunter of the dead, and a man with one purpose in life, to destroy Gregor Von Drach. "Abomination! Your time ends here," Feuerbach roared. Before Gregor could react, the warhammer crashed into his chest with the force of a meteor. Pain exploded through his body. Gregor staggered backward, the impact sending shockwaves of holy energy rippling through his very bones. His ribs shattered, the runes on the hammer burning against his undead flesh. It had been centuries since he had felt true pain. He fell to one knee, his breath ragged, blood leaking from his lips. His vision blurred, but still he gripped his sword, forcing himself to rise. Feuerbach advanced, his hammer raised for the killing blow. "By Sigmar's light, I cast you into the abyss." The hammer fell once more, but Gregor moved. With one last burst of speed, he twisted aside, the sacred weapon smashing into the ground where he had knelt just seconds before. With all his strength, he drove his blade forward, piercing through Feuerbach's gut, shoving it deep past ribs and flesh. The warrior priest gasped, the fire in his eyes flickering. Gregor leaned in close, his breath cold against the man's ear. "Sigmar is not here," he whispered. With one final pull, he ripped the sword free, the priest's lifeblood spilling onto the ground. Feuerbach staggered, dropping to his knees, clutching at the fatal wound. And then he fell, his final breath lost to the wind. But Gregor had no time to savor his victory. A shadow loomed. Grand Marshal Hendrik von Recken was coming, and this battle was far from over. Chapter 8. The Howl of the Grave. The battle for Schwarzburg Keep had become a slaughter. The main gate was lost, its ancient iron hinges now nothing more than twisted wreckage. Imperial troops flooded through the breach, their war cries filling the air as they carved through the remnants of the undead defenders. The Reiksguard pushed forward, their lances splintering against the rusted armor of the Graveguard, while halberdiers and greatswords hacked their way deeper into the keep's shattered halls. Above it all, cannon fire rained from the sky, tearing through what little remained of the fortress walls. The keep shuddered under the onslaught, its foundations groaning as cracks spread like veins through the curses. And yet, Gregor Von Drach still stood. His blackened armor was cracked, the imprint of a Sigmarite warhammer still burned into his breastplate. Blood, dark and thick, seeped from his lips, but he paid it no mind. He could not die here. Not yet. He had one last card to play. The final reserves. Gregor strode through the ruined corridors, his boots echoing against the stone, his path taking him ever deeper into the shadows. The air grew thick with the stench of rot and decay, the scent of something ancient, something monstrous waiting to be unleashed. He reached a great iron door, reinforced with chains thick as a man's arm. Behind it, the beasts stirred, their growls reverberating through the stone. The air was thick with the sound of claw against metal, the low, guttural snarls of things that had once been men, but no longer. Gregor placed a gauntleted hand against the door. "Unleash them." His wights hesitated only for a moment before obeying. The chains were unfastened, the locks broken apart. The doors creaked open, releasing the horrors within. And the crypt horrors came forth. Massive, hulking abominations of flesh and bone, their rotting muscles pulsing with dark energy, their clawed hands twitching in anticipation. Their milky, blind eyes rolled in their sockets as they emerged from the dark, their hulking forms towering over the battlefield. And behind them, the true terror. Bound in runes of blood and iron, its yellow eyes burning with primal hunger, the Vargulf crouched in its cage of bone. A once proud scion of the von Karstein bloodline, now nothing more than a ravenous beast, twisted beyond recognition. Fangs like daggers protruded from its snarling maw, and black veins pulsed beneath its sickly pale skin. It thrashed, the cage barely holding it back. Gregor stepped forward, his voice a whisper of command. "Go, feast, kill." The ruined locks snapped apart. With an earth-shaking roar, the Vargulf lunged forward, smashing through the remains of the gate. And the howling began. The carnage. The Empire's forces barely had time to react before the crypt horrors and the Vargulf crashed into them. One crypt horror snatched an Imperial greatsword in one massive hand, lifting the man as easily as a child would lift a doll. The soldier screamed as the horror bit into his chest, tearing ribs and flesh apart before tossing the ruined corpse aside. Another horror charged into the ranks of halberdiers, their weapons barely piercing its rotting hide before it crushed them beneath its bulk. The Vargulf was worse. It moved like a shadow, one moment upon the broken stone, the next tearing through the rake's guard as if they were paper. It ripped a knight from his saddle, its claws slicing through the man's plate armor as though it were parchment. It lunged upon another, its fangs crushing his skull in a single bite. The Imperial lines wavered. For the first time since the battle began, fear took hold. "Hold the line! In Sigmar's name, hold!" the officers bellowed. But it was useless. The Vargulf tore through them. And then the fire came. The death of the Vargulf. Through the chaos, one figure advanced, wreathed in the light of Sigmar's wrath. A warrior priest, his golden armor shining like the sun, stood his ground against the raging beast. In his right hand, a sacred warhammer, its runes burning with divine fire. In his left, a tome, its parchment alight with the prayers of his god. The Vargulf turned, its yellow eyes locking onto its next prey. The priest did not falter. "You are a curse upon this world, beast. By Sigmar's will, I cast you back into the abyss." The Vargulf lunged, its claws outstretched. "Riot!" The priest swung. The hammer met flesh, and holy fire erupted across the beast's body. The Vargulf shrieked, not in pain, but in pure primal terror. The fire seared through its undead flesh, its cursed blood boiling within its veins. It reared back, its body wreathed in golden flames, its screams shaking the very walls of Schwarzburg. And then, with one final pained cry, the beast collapsed, its body smoldering into ash. Gregor watched from the ruins of the courtyard, his expression cold. The Vargulf was dead. The Empire had not broken. The battle was lost. The retreat. Gregor turned as the walls of Schwarzburg shuddered beneath another cannon blast. The fortress was collapsing. "Fall back," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. The undead began their retreat, pulling back into the inner sanctum of the keep. The few remaining crypt horrors lumbered after them, their wounds deep, their strength waning. The goblin railing had come down, hundreds of small flying creatures darting out with unmatched speed and effort. Gregor cast one last glance at the battlefield, at the Empire's forces, rallying now in the Vargulf's absence. The Knights of Sigmar pressed forward. The holy men chanted their prayers. And above them all, Grand Marshal Hendrik von Rochen raised his great sword high, his voice ringing with victory. "Press fall and press forward, wipe this filth from the earth." Gregor gritted his teeth, retreating into the depths of the keep. The battle was not over, but it was coming to its final hour. Chapter 9. Death's Gambit. The halls of Schwarzburg keep trembled, the very foundations groaning beneath the relentless fury of the Empire's siege. Stone crumbled, ancient walls buckled, and the screams of the dying, both mortal and undead, echoed through the darkened corridors. Deep within the fortress, past the shattered remnants of once mighty defenses, Captain Gregor Von Drach strode through the dimly lit corridors, his crimson cloak tattered, his blackened armor cracked and blood-stained. His body bore the mark of battle, deep wounds that would have killed a lesser being. But he was not lesser. Not yet. The keep was lost, but the Count was almost free. That was all that mattered. Gregor entered the inner sanctum, where the air was thick with necrotic energy. Braziers burned with eerie green flame, casting ghostly shadows upon the walls of the great chamber. And there, standing before an altar of bone and obsidian, was Adelheid the Pale. The necromancer did not turn as Gregor approached. She already knew why he was here. "You come to me now, Captain?" she murmured, her voice a whisper of dry leaves. The air shimmered around her, thick with the presence of the dead. "Have you come to beg the gods for mercy?" Gregor's lips curled in amusement. We both know mercy does not dwell in these halls." Adelheid chuckled, her bony fingers tracing the surface of a great black tome, its pages rippling as if they were alive. "No, I suppose it does not." She turned then, her colorless eyes locking onto his. "You have little time, Gregor. The Empire is at your throat." Gregory nodded. "I know." Adelheid studied him, her expression unreadable. "And yet you still fight. Why?" Gregor exhaled, the sound like wind through a graveyard. "Because duty is not yet fulfilled." A low, whispering wind coiled through the chamber, unseen voices hissing in the darkness. Adelheid closed the tome before stepping toward him, her robes flowing like shadows. "There is a way," she said softly. Gregor's eyes narrowed. "What are you speaking of?" Adelheid reached out, her skeletal fingers brushing against his armor. The touch was cold as the grave. "A way to ensure you do not fall. A way to make your stand eternal." Gregor stiffened. "I can bring you back," she said. "Even if your body is broken, even if your soul is cast into the abyss, I can pull you back." She stepped closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. "You would rise again, Gregor. Not as you are, but as something more." Gregor felt a chill run through him. He already knew what she was offering. The Mortis Revenant, a soul bound beyond death, neither truly undead nor alive. A thing of shadow and hate, cursed to stalk the world forever trapped between the veil. Gregor had seen such creatures before, and he had sworn never to become one. The price of eternity. Gregor turned away, his grip tightening on his blackened sword. "No." Adelheid blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "No?" Gregor faced her once more, his crimson eyes burning with finality. "I will not return from death, Adelheid." The necromancer's gaze darkened. "Why?" Gregor exhaled slowly. "Because death is meant to be an ending, even for us." Adelheid's expression twisted with something between anger and amusement. "You speak of endings as if they were choices." She stepped forward, her voice turning sharp. "You are Gregor Von Drach, captain of the von Karstein legions, slayer of men and monster alike. You have defied the will of gods and mortals for centuries, and now, at the precipice of oblivion, you suddenly seek peace?" She laughed, a sound like cracking bone. "You disappoint me, Captain." Gregor did not waver. "I am not afraid of death, Adelheid, but I will not become something I despise." For a long moment, the two stood in silence. The fortress shook once more, another cannon blast rocking the chamber. The Empire was coming. "At last," Adelheid sighed. She stepped back, shaking her head. "Then die as you are," she murmured, "and be forgotten." Gregor smirked. "I do not need to be remembered. Only that the Count escapes." Adelheid studied him for a final moment before turning away. The spell was abandoned, the ritual left unfinished. Gregor felt no regret. The final stand. Gregor left the inner sanctum and emerged onto the ruined battlements of Schwarzburg one last time. From here he could see the Empire's army pressing forward, the final assault now in full force. Flaming arrows filled the sky, streaking toward the keep. The gate was in ruins, and through it surged the Reiksguard, greatswords, and warrior priests. It was the end. Gregor gripped his sword, taking in the carnage below. His graveguard were falling, their once impenetrable ranks splintering under the holy fury of the Sigmarites. The skeletal legions lay broken, their bones crushed beneath the boots of the living. And yet the undead still fought. They would not surrender. Gregor took a breath. The air was thick with smoke, death, and ruin. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing down upon him. But he was not afraid. Gregor Von Drach had been many things, a warrior, a captain, a monster. Now he would be a legend. He raised his sword, pointing it toward the oncoming tide of Imperial knights. Come then. Face the dead. His voice rang through the battlefield like a challenge to the gods themselves. The Empire answered. 1,000 blades rushed toward him. Gregor charged, and the final battle of Schwarzburg began in blood. Chapter 10. The Shadow of Sigmar. The fires of Schwarzburg raged as the Empire's forces pushed deeper into the keep, their war cries echoing off the crumbling stone. The dead fought on, heedless of pain, but Gregor Von Drach knew that this was no longer a battle. This was a funeral pyre. And he was the one being burned. Yet something was wrong. Despite the chaos, despite the crumbling walls and the ever-advancing Imperial war machine, the fortress was burning too quickly. The fire was not the random destruction of war. It was deliberate. Gregor's eyes narrowed. The keep was being set ablaze from within. There was only one kind of man who would dare such a thing. The witch hunter. The infiltrator? Smoke curled through the corridors like whispering ghosts as Gregor moved through the inner halls. The stench of burning wood and sacred oils filled the air, clinging to the ruins like a death shroud. He moved quickly, his inhuman senses guiding him through the smoke, tracking the scent of iron and black powder. He could hear footsteps, light and careful, the movements of a predator. And then he saw him. Otto Halbrecht, the witch hunter of Altdorf. Gregor had heard of him, a fanatic, one of the Empire's deadliest hunters of the undead. Unlike the battle-hardened soldiers and war priests outside, Halbrecht did not fight wars. He ended monsters. Gregor watched from the shadows as Halbrecht moved with quiet purpose, setting alchemical charges along the support pillars of the keep. Bottles of holy oil, blessed by Sigmarite priests, were uncorked and poured across the stone, filling the air with the acrid scent of burning faith. Gregor stepped forward, his sword scraping against the floor, a deliberate sound. "You work quickly, hunter." Halbrecht froze, his muscles tensing beneath his leather coat. Slowly he turned, his pale blue eyes locking onto Gregor's crimson gaze. Then, without a word, he drew his pistol and fired. Duel in the ashes. Gregory moved before the shot rang out, his unnatural speed carrying him aside. The silver bullet grazed his shoulder, searing flesh and armor alike. A mortal wound for any lesser vampire, but Gregory was no lesser creature. Halbrecht did not hesitate. He discarded the pistol, drawing his blade of blessed silver, a long sword etched with runes of Sigmar, its surface glowing with a dull, holy radiance. Gregor unsheathed his own weapon, black steel, old as the von Karstein line, stained with the blood of countless men. Blessed silver met cursed steel. The first strike came from Halbrecht, quick and brutal, aiming for Gregor's heart. Gregor parried, twisting his wrist, forcing the hunter to pivot. Halbrecht pressed forward, his blade moving in fast, precise cuts, the movements of a man who had fought and slain vampires before. Gregor sidestepped, countered, their weapons clashing again and again, sparks flying in the darkness. A lesser vampire would have been overwhelmed. Gregor was not lesser. He slammed his boot into Halbrecht's chest, sending the hunter staggering back, but Halbrecht recovered instantly, rolling into a low stance and lunging forward once more. Gregor twisted, but not fast enough. The silver blade bit deep into his side, searing his flesh, the holy runes burning him from within. Pain flared through his body, white-hot and excruciating. Halbrecht pressed the advantage, driving the blade deeper, his eyes alight with triumph. No monster lives forever. Gregor snarled, his fangs bared. No, but you die tonight. With inhuman strength, he seized Halbrecht's wrist, twisting it until bones snapped. The hunter cried out, but Gregor did not let go. He wrenched the sword free from his side, ignoring the pain, and in the same motion drove his own blade through Halbrecht's stomach. The hunter gasped, blood flecking his lips. Gregor leaned close, his voice a whisper of death. "Tell your god I send my regards." With one final, brutal twist, he ripped the sword upward, splitting Halbrecht open. The witch-hunter collapsed, his body hitting the stone floor in a pool of crimson and firelight. For the first time in his life, Otto Halbrecht, the hunter of monsters, knew the silence of the grave. The keep burns. Gregor staggered back, clutching his wound, feeling the holy fire still eating at his flesh. His vision blurred, but he remained standing. He looked around. The fire was spreading faster now, the witch-hunter's work already too far along. The inner halls were collapsing, the roof above him groaning under the weight of the destruction. Gregor exhaled, steadying himself. He had no time left. The Empire was inside the keep. The walls were falling, and he had one final battle to fight. With one last look at the lifeless body of Otto Halbrecht, Gregor turned and walked back into the war, his sword still dripping with the blood of a hunter. Chapter 11. The red moon rises. The air was thick with ash and blood as Schwarzburg keep burned. Gregor Von Drach moved swiftly through the crumbling corridors, the scent of fire and death filling his lungs. His armor was cracked, his wounds deep, but his purpose remained unshaken. This was the final hour. He had one task left to complete: the Count's escape. In the depths of Schwarzburg, where the bones of forgotten warriors lay entombed, a black iron door stood half open. Beyond it, the ancient hidden passage yawned like the maw of some great beast, its tunnel winding deep into the mountain beyond the keep. Inside, Count Alaric von Karstein stood at the threshold, his crimson eyes burning in the darkness. His retinue, a handful of vampires and their mortal thralls, were already disappearing into the shadows beyond. He turned, meeting Gregor's gaze one last time. Gregor bowed his head. "The path is clear, my lord. The Empire will not follow." Alaric hesitated. "You should come with us." Gregor shook his head. "You know I cannot." The Count's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "You have served me well, Gregor." Gregor met his gaze without hesitation. "I have served Sylvania." Alaric studied him for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod. Without another word, he turned and vanished into the tunnel, his form swallowed by the eternal dark. Gregor watched until the last flicker of torchlight faded, ensuring that the Count was truly gone. Then he closed the iron door and sealed the passage shut. There would be no pursuit. The Empire would have only him. The last stand. Gregor ascended the ruins of Schwarzburg for the last time, stepping out onto the shattered courtyard. The walls were caving in, great slabs of stone tumbling into the abyss below. Beyond the broken gate, the Empire stood waiting. Rows of halberdiers and great swords, their armor stained with blood and soot, surrounded the keep's final stronghold. The Reiksguard remained mounted, their banners dripping with rain and gore, their lances lowered in silent challenge. At the head of the Imperial host, astride a war-horse clad in gilded barding, sat Grand Marshal Hendrik von Rocken. His blade was drawn, still slick with the blood of Gregor's kind. His stern blue eyes held neither hatred nor cruelty, only the cold resolve of a man who had come to finish a war. For a long moment there was silence. Then the Grand Marshal spoke. "That is over." Gregor remained motionless, his grip tightening on his blade. Von Rochen raised his voice, his words carrying across the battlefield. "The vampire lord has fled. Your keep burns. Your forces are scattered." He gestured toward the ruins. "You are alone." Gregor did not flinch. Von Rochen studied him for a moment longer, then exhaled. "You are no mindless beast, Gregor Von Drach. You have fought with honor if such a thing exists in your kind." He raised his sword slightly. "Surrender." The word hung in the air like a knife's edge. Gregor tilted his head slightly, his crimson eyes meeting those of the Grand Marshal. Slowly, deliberately, He lowered his sword, and it plunged it into the ground before him. The Empire's soldiers stiffened, waiting for his next move. Gregor smiled, his fangs glinting in the firelight. "I think not." With one final motion he tore his cloak from his shoulders, letting it drift into the flames. He spread his arms wide, a mocking gesture, as if embracing the inferno around him. "You came here to slay a monster, Grand Marshal," Gregor called. "Then finish your duty." Von Drach's jaw tightened. Then, without another word, he raised his blade. For Sigmar, the order was given, and the Empire descended upon him. Chapter 12. The Last Charge. The ruins of Schwarzburg Keep burned around him, the flames reaching toward the night sky like the grasping hands of the damned. The air was thick with ash and blood, the ground littered with the broken bodies of the dead and dying. Gregor Von Drach stood alone. Behind him, what little remained of his graveguard gathered in silence, their eyes empty, their great swords still slick with the blood of men. Once they had been knights, lords, champions of Sylvania. Now they were nothing more than death given form, waiting for their captain's final command. Before them, the Empire's host stood ready, a wall of steel and fury, their weapons gleaming beneath the inferno's glow. Reiksguard knights, their lances lowered, greatswords, their massive blades poised to strike. Warrior priests, their warhammers gripped with holy purpose. At their head, astride his gilded warhorse, was Grand Marshal Hendrik von Rauken. His sword was drawn, his expression was grim. Gregor exhaled, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. This was the end, and he would meet it on his feet. He lifted his sword, the motion slow but deliberate, a final salute. "Omblastai, my brothers." The Graveguard did not speak, but they understood. Gregor turned his gaze back to the Imperials before him, his crimson eyes blazing. Then he charged, and his dead followed. The butcher's work. The impact was like a thunderclap, steel shattering against steel, flesh torn asunder, as Gregor and his Graveguard crashed into the Imperial lines. A halberdier thrust forward, his blade gleaming. Gregor severed the man's arm at the elbow, stepping past him before driving his sword through another soldier's chest. A Reiksguard knight barreled toward him, lance poised to impale. Gregor twisted aside, grabbing the knight by his breastplate and ripping him from the saddle before crushing his skull beneath his boot. To his left, his Graveguard carved a path through the mortals, their massive greatswords splitting men apart with each deliberate swing. To his right, Imperial soldiers screamed, their lines collapsing under the onslaught. For a moment, Gregor allowed himself to believe. Perhaps he could break them. Perhaps Schwarzburg would not fall this night. Then the warhammers came. The Reiksguard fell back, parting like the sea to reveal Grand Marshal Hendrik von Rauken. He rode toward Gregor, his sword gleaming with holy runes, his warhorse's hooves striking the ground like drums of judgment. Gregor stepped forward, raising his sword in both hands. "Face me, von Rauken. Let this end with steel." The Grand Marshal dismounted, his eyes locked onto Gregor's. The two warriors stood among the ruin, surrounded by the broken remnants of Schwarzburg, the flames casting long shadows between them. No more words, only war. Von Rauken moved first, his blade flashing with terrifying speed, striking for Gregor's heart. Gregor parried, twisting aside, his own sword lashing toward the marshal's throat. Von Rauken blocked, countering with a powerful overhead strike. Gregor caught the blade on his own, the force of the impact shaking his arms to the bone. They moved like wraiths, their swords clashing again and again, light against darkness, faith against damnation. Gregor fented low, then struck for the ribs. Von Rauken sidestepped, his blade carving a deep gash across Gregor's shoulder. Pain flared, but Gregor pushed through it, driving forward, his blade catching the Grand Marshal's breastplate and cutting deep into his side. Von Rauken staggered, blood spilling onto the ground. For a moment the battle paused, both warriors bleeding, both standing, neither willing to fall. Then the Grand Marshal roared and attacked again. His sword came down like an executioner's blade, and Gregor met it head-on. The impact sent Gregor to his knees, the force splitting his armor, tearing through his flesh. The Grand Marshal's blade struck deep, biting through muscle and bone, piercing the vampire's undead heart. Gregor gasped, blood spilling from his lips. Von Drach exhaled, his own strength failing, his wounds catching up to him. He looked down at Gregor, his breathing ragged, his sword buried in the captain's chest. "It's over, vampire," the Grand Marshal rasped. Gregor's fingers tightened around his sword hilt, and he smiled. Not yet. With one final burst of strength, Gregor drove his blade upward, piercing straight through the Grand Marshal's ribs. Von Drach's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. Gregor twisted the blade. The Grand Marshal of the Empire fell. Gregor slumped forward, his vision darkening, the pain finally overtaking him. The flames of Schwarzburg roared. The red moon hung high above, watching, and Gregor collapsed into the blood-stained dirt, his sword still embedded in the heart of the man who had slain him. Schwarzburg had fallen, but so had its conqueror. Chapter 13. The Dead Will Not Rest. The fires of Schwarzburg Keep burned high into the night, casting their eerie glow upon the slaughtered battlefield. The walls had crumbled, the undead legions lay broken, and the Empire's banners stood victorious over the ruin. Yet not all was silent. Beneath the ruined battlements, where the air was thick with the scent of blood and death, Adelheid the Pale knelt over Gregor Von Drach's lifeless form. His blade was still lodged in the corpse of Grand Marshal Hendrik von Rauchen, the two warriors lying in the mud like mirror images of one another, one dead, one undead, both slain. Gregor's eyes, once burning crimson, were now dark, his blackened armor slick with the blood of Imperials and his own cursed Icar. He had fought. He had died well. But Adelheid would not allow him to stay dead. The necromancer pressed a skeletal hand to his chest, her hollow eyes shimmering with unnatural power. "You swore to die for the Count, Gregor, but I never swore to let you stay dead." She drew forth a dagger of obsidian, its blade pulsating with eerie, unnatural light. Around her, the air thickened, the very essence of undeath coiling around the shattered remains of Schwarzburg. She began to chant, her voice dry and brittle, calling upon the black winds of necromancy. The words were old, older than Sylvania, older than the Empire itself. The language of the dead, the whispers of forgotten gods. The ground trembled. The corpse of Gregor Von Drach twitched. Adelheid smiled, and then his eyes snapped open. The Revenant awakens. The first thing Gregor felt was rage, not the cold calculation of a vampire, but something deeper, something primal. Something wrong. He gasped, his body seizing as Adelheid's spell took hold, his blackened blood boiling in his veins. A searing cold fire spread through his limbs, warping them, reshaping them, turning him into something else. His fingers curled into claws, his vision burned with green fire, and his body, his broken, dying body, was remade. He was Gregor Von Drach no longer. He was something worse, a mortis revenant, bound not by hunger nor loyalty, but by death itself. His vision blurred, his senses twisting and distorting, but he could feel the living all around him. He could hear their hearts beating. He could smell their blood, and he hated them. A growl escaped his throat, low and unnatural, as his body lurched forward. His sword rose once more, but it no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like an extension of something deeper, something uncontrollable. And then he attacked. The butchery. The Imperial soldiers never saw it coming. The first Reichsguard knight turned toward the ruins of the duel, his breath still ragged from the battle. His eyes widened in horror as Gregor Von Drach, risen anew, drove his blade straight through his chest. The knight barely had time to scream before Gregor ripped his sword free, leaving his corpse to crumple into the dirt. The second man fell before he could raise his halberd, Gregor's clawed hand crushing his throat with inhuman strength. Gregor did not think, he only killed. His blade carved through flesh and steel, his movements too fast, too vicious. He was no longer fighting, he was butchering. Soldiers screamed as he tore into them, their formations breaking apart in terror. A handgunner fired a silver-shot round into Gregor's chest, the bullet tearing through his undead flesh, but Gregor did not even slow. A warrior priest charged, his warhammer raised high, his voice booming with holy power. Gregor ripped his arm from his socket before he could bring the hammer down. A witch hunter tried to bless his blade, reciting prayers to Sigmar. Gregor silenced him with a single swing, his head tumbling into the dirt. Gregor could feel the battle shifting. He could feel the fear, the panic, and he relished it. The wrath of Sigmar. But then the Empire rallied. From the broken ranks, a group of warrior priests gathered, their eyes burning with holy fury. Lectors and witch hunters, their Sigmarite icons glowing with sacred power, stepped forward. They raised their war hammers, their tomes of faith, their relics of divine might, and then they began to chant. The air shifted. The battlefield hummed with power. Gregor felt it immediately, the presence of something greater, something he could not fight. The holy magic surged toward him, crashing like a tidal wave of divine wrath. Pain seared through his body, not the physical pain of steel, but something deeper, a pain that touched his soul, something he could not heal from. He staggered, his vision blurring, his strength beginning to fade. The warrior priests pressed forward, their voices booming. Back to the grave, monster. A hammer of light struck his chest, sending him stumbling backward. A second struck his side, his bones cracking under the force of the divine. A third blow came, this time from a knight wielding a blade bathed in holy fire, cutting through his cursed flesh, severing tendons, muscle, bone. Gregor roared, but it was a dying sound. His body failed him, the necromantic energy unraveling, the magic that had bound him together shattering under the weight of Sigmar's wrath. He dropped to one knee, his vision darkening, his sword slipping from his grasp. For the second time that night, Gregor Von Drach fell. The end of Revenant. The warrior priests stood over him, their war hammers glowing with holy power. One of them, a grizzled lector, stepped forward. His eyes were filled with exhaustion, but not mercy. Patrice Barnett. A Sigmarite banner was raised, the flames consuming Gregor's fallen form. The fire caught instantly, spreading across his body, the sacred energy consuming the last remnants of his unholy existence. Gregor did not scream. He only watched as the flames devoured him, the world fading into silence. And then, at last, there was only ash. Chapter 14. The Pyre of the Damned. The fires of Schwarzburg Keep burned so brightly that they could be seen from the farthest reaches of Sylvania. Flames roared into the night, consuming the once mighty fortress, the ancient stronghold of the von Karsteins now nothing more than a crumbling ruin, its cursed stones cracking under the relentless heat. The Empire had won, but it had come at a price. Hundreds of their dead lay strewn across the battlefield, their bodies mingled with those of the fallen undead. Knights in gleaming armor lay broken, their lances shattered. Priests of Sigmar clutched their holy relics in stiff hands, their last words of defiance still etched on their lips. And amid the carnage, the last remnants of Gregor Von Drach smoldered in the cursed flames, his revenant form torn asunder, his once unyielding strength reduced to nothing more than charred ruin. The end of the Revenant. The Sigmarite fire had done its work well. What remained of Gregor Von Drach was a blackened husk, barely recognizable as the warrior who had defied the Empire until the very end. His armor had melted into his flesh, his bones cracked and blackened, the once mighty sword that had cut down so many Imperials reduced to a ruined scrap of metal. The witch hunters stood over the remains, their faces cold. Their work was not yet complete. One of them, a grizzled hunter with a scarred face, stepped forward, holding aloft a holy icon of Sigmar. His voice rang out, firm and resolute. "No trace of the vampire shall remain. Let none say he may return. Let his soul be damned for eternity." The other hunters murmured words of exorcism, their prayers filling the air with a sacred energy that made even the strongest among them shudder. Then they raised their torches. Holy fire consumed Gregor's body, the final shreds of necromantic power burning away, Sigmar's light searing even the cursed remnants of his soul. The fire burned for what felt like hours, the air filled with the sickly stench of burning flesh and ancient magic unraveling. Then, at last, the fire died, and Gregor Von Drach, captain of the von Karsteins, slayer of men, breaker of armies, the butcher of Stirland, was gone. There would be no resurrection. Schwarzburg falls. With the last of the undead purged, the Empire's forces moved through Schwarzburg, their work still unfinished. "Burn it all! Leave nothing standing!" ordered one of the witch hunters. The torches were thrown. Flames caught on the ancient banners of the von Karsteins, devouring their sigils and history in moments. Books of forbidden lore were reduced to cinders. Tombs of forgotten dead collapsed under the weight of sacred fire. The fortress, which had stood for centuries, which had been a refuge for the dead, was now nothing more than a pyre. The Empire had erased it from the world. And still, somewhere within the depths of the keep, something watched. Something escaped. The pale shadow. Deep within the ruins, shrouded in mist and death, Adelheid the Pale stood. The necromancer had not fled. He had waited and watched as the Empire crushed Schwarzburg, as the Night Lord she had sought to preserve was erased from existence, as the history of the von Karsteins was cast into flame. Her hollow eyes watched the fire, watched the witch hunters sneer, watched the priests clutch their holy relics with pride. And she whispered, "Fools." With a gesture, the shadows around her stirred, coiling like living things. The Empire believed the war was over. They were wrong. The dead do not forget. She turned away from the burning ruin, her skeletal fingers curling around an old, tattered tome, its pages filled with forbidden spells, spells even she had never dared to use. "And we do not forgive." Then, with a whisper of ancient words, she was gone, vanishing into the night. The war for Schwarzburg was over, but the war for Sylvania had just begun. Chapter 15. The Count's Lament. The night in Drachenhof Keep was darker than most. The wind howled through the spires of the great fortress, carrying with it the scent of distant blood and damp stone. Shadows clung to the walls like creeping phantoms, stretching across the endless halls of the von Karstein stronghold. Count Alaric von Karstein stood upon the highest balcony gazing over the twisting forests of Sylvania. The air was cold, empty, as if the land itself was mourning something lost. And Alaric knew why. A lone figure approached from the shadows, their boots silent upon the obsidian floor. A vampire thrall, clad in dark finery, his face pale and expressionless, knelt before the Count. "My lord," the thrall murmured, "the last of the scouts have returned." Alaric did not move, his crimson gaze still locked upon the distant horizon. "And?" The thrall hesitated. "Schwarzburg is gone, my lord, burned to the ground." The wind picked up, tearing through Alaric's cloak, but he remained still. He already knew this. The thrall bowed his head lower. "Gregor is dead." For a long moment the Count did not respond. The flames of the nearby torches flickered, their light casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. Then, slowly, Alaric closed his eyes. Gregor Von Drach, his sword, his shield, his most loyal captain, gone, not simply slain, erased. The Empire had not left a corpse to be raised, no remains for the necromancers to pull from the grave. They had destroyed him completely. Did he fall as he wished? Alaric's voice was quiet, but sharp as a blade drawn in mourning. The thrall hesitated before answering. Not until the last, he took the Grand Marshal of the Empire with him. Alaric's eyes flickered open. Then he did not die in vain. But even as he spoke the words, they rang hollow. Gregor had bought him time, had held Schwarzburg alone, had taken on the wrath of the Empire itself, so that Alaric could escape. Gregor had done his duty, and now Alaric would do his. The road to vengeance. Alaric turned, his crimson gaze burning. "The witch hunters will celebrate tonight," he said. "They will believe they have purged me from Sylvania." The thrall nodded. "They believe you weak, a broken prince." A slow, bitter smile spread across the Count's lips. "Good, let them believe it." He stepped forward, the hem of his cloak dragging across the black stone, his voice growing colder. "They have taken my keep, they have taken my captain, they have burned one of my houses to the ground." His fingers curled into a claw-like grip, his fangs flashing in the dim light. But I still live, I still rule, and I am patient." He looked toward the distant empire, the lands of men and faith, his gaze darkening. Gregor had given his unlife for him, and Alaric would not forget. "War with the Empire will come," he murmured, "but not today." He turned away from the balcony, stepping into the shadows of the great hall. "Let them revel in their victory," he said. "For now." And with those words, he disappeared into the darkness. The Empire thought they had won, but vengeance is eternal. Chapter 16. The Promotion. The air in Altdorf was heavy with the weight of victory and loss. The bells of the great cathedral of Sigmar tolled, their deep echoes rolling through the stone streets of the Imperial capital. The people gathered in the squares, their voices hushed, their heads bowed in solemn reverence. Priests chanted hymns, their words laced with both triumph and mourning. Schwarzburg had fallen. The vampires had been purged. The Empire had won. Yet the cost had been steep. Beneath the towering statues of past emperors, within the gilded halls of the Reichsguard fortress, the War Council had assembled. The room was filled with high-ranking officers, warrior priests, and veteran generals, their armors still scarred from battle. A great banner of the Reichsguard hung behind the long table, where the highest-ranking men of the Empire sat in silence. For at the head of the room, upon a great black-draped table, lay the body of Grand Marshal Hendrik von Rocken. His armor was shattered, his sword broken, but his hand still clutched the hilt of his weapon. Even in death, he had refused to let it go. A war hero, a legend, slain by the vampire Captain Gregor Von Drach in single combat. His death had not been in vain, but it had left a void, and the Empire could not afford weakness. A new Grand Marshal. Step forward, Ludwig Faust. The voice of Emperor Karl Franz carried through the chamber, though he himself was not present. His decree had already been given. The assembled generals stood in silence, their eyes turning toward the man who now bore the weight of the Empire's command. Ludwig Faust rose from where he had knelt before the council. Once a lieutenant, then a prisoner of Gregor von Drach, and now Grand Marshal of the Reichsguard. His armor had been freshly polished, his wounds bandaged, but his eyes held the shadow of battle. He had seen the horrors of Schwarzburg, had felt the cold grip of undeath, had stared into the crimson eyes of monsters who should not have walked the earth. And he had survived. An elder priest of Sigmar, clad in golden robes, stepped forward. In his hands he carried a warhammer, its head glowing with holy light, the symbol of the Grand Marshal's station. Ludwig knelt once more, his back straight, his jaw set. The priest raised the hammer. "Do you swear by Sigmar's name, by the light of the Empire, by the blood of those who have fallen, to defend the realm from all enemies, be they man, beast, or abomination?" Ludwig did not hesitate. "I swear it." The hammer descended, touching his shoulders in the sacred rite of promotion. He replied, "Rise, Grand Marshal of the Reichsguard." Ludwig stood, the weight of the title settling upon him. The chamber erupted into a chorus of war cries, knights striking their fists upon their breastplates, warrior priests raising their hammers in salute. A new Grand Marshal had been chosen. But as the voices rose in celebration, Ludwig remained silent, his gaze fixed upon the map of Sylvania, still spread across the war table. His hands tightened into fists, for he knew this war was not over. The shadow on the horizon. As the council dispersed, Ludwig remained behind, his eyes tracing the cursed lands of Sylvania upon the map. He had fought there. He had bled there. And he knew the truth that the others did not wish to speak aloud. Gregor Von Drach was gone. The Schwarzburg keep was ash. But the von Karsteins still lived. Count Alaric had escaped, and that meant the war had only been delayed. A knight approached, bowing his head respectfully. "Grand Marshal, our forces are withdrawing from Sylvania. The war is concluded." Ludwig's gaze remained fixed on the map. "No, it isn't." The knight hesitated. "But, my lord, the vampires are scattered, their fortress is destroyed. They are—" Ludwig's hand slammed down on the table, his voice sharp as steel. "They are waiting." The knight stiffened, his mouth opening, then closing. Ludwig straightened, his eyes dark and filled with certainty. "This is how they have survived for centuries. They wait in the shadows. They let us believe we have won." His fingers traced the mountainous paths leading deeper into Sylvania, where Drachenhof Keep still stood. "Zing, they are not defeated, they are watching." He turned, his voice low. "And one night, when we least expect it, they will return." The knight swallowed but nodded. "What would you have us do, my lord?" Ludwig's expression hardened, his jaw tight. "We'll be ready." He turned away from the table, the weight of his new title pressing down upon his shoulders. The Empire rejoiced. But Ludwig Faust knew better. The war was not over. It was only waiting for the right moment to begin again. Chapter 17. The Echoes of Schwarzburg. The land where Schwarzburg Keep once stood had turned to ruin. Nothing remained but charred stone and scorched earth, the fortress erased from existence by the Empire's fire and faith. The once proud banner of the von Karsteins had been reduced to ash, its sigil lost to the wind. But the memory of the battle and of the warrior who had stood against an army alone refused to die. The legend grows. Across the villages of Sturland, the tale of Gregor Von Drach began to spread. At first it was spoken of only in whispers, muttered by soldiers who had fought at Schwarzburg and survived. The old veterans, their faces weathered by war, would speak of the Undying Captain, the vampire knight who had held the gates against an army, who had cut down Imperial champions, and who had fought even after death itself had claimed him. They spoke of the final duel, where Gregor had slain the Grand Marshal of the Empire even as he fell. They spoke of the Empire's fire, of Sigmar's holy wrath, but still, some men shivered when they thought of the ruins. Because some swore that Gregor was not gone. Some swore that Schwarzburg still belonged to the dead, the ruins of the dead. The first to disappear were the grave robbers. The war had left many bodies behind, and there were always those desperate enough to pick over the remains. Some came seeking treasures of the von Karsteins, hoping to find gold, weapons, anything of worth. Others came simply to loot the dead, but none of them returned. Villagers told stories of men who ventured into the ruins and never came back. Their torches would be seen flickering in the night, wandering through the broken stones, only to vanish without a sound. Some claimed they had heard footsteps echoing through the ruins, though no one walked there. Some swore they had seen a figure standing atop the shattered battlements, clad in blackened armor, his crimson cloak stirring in the wind, watching. One night, a drunken soldier from an Imperial garrison boasted that Gregor Von Drach was no more than a story, that Schwarzburg was nothing but rubble. The next morning he was found dead outside the ruins, his throat ripped open, his blood drained from his body. His sword was still in its sheath. The men who buried him refused to speak of what they had found. The ghost of Schwarzburg. As the years passed, the stories only grew. The peasants of Stirland avoided the ruins, calling it cursed ground. Hunters who strayed too close spoke of a strange presence, an unnatural cold that seeped into the bones. Some claimed that, on certain nights, when Mansleb was full and Morsleb leered from the sky, you could hear the clash of swords in the ruins, as if the battle had never ended. And on those nights, if you listened closely, you could hear a voice carried on the wind, a voice filled with cold, undying defiance. "Face me." They called him the Undying Captain. A ghost, a monster, or something worse, no one knew for certain. But the Empire had sought to erase Gregor Von Drach from history, and yet his name still remained, waiting, watching, unforgotten. Chapter 18. A Witch Hunter's Oath. The ruins of Schwarzburg Keep still smoldered when Elsa arrived. A witch hunter of Altorf, sworn to the Order of the Silver Stake, she had come not to celebrate the Empire's victory, but to ensure the war was truly over. She did not trust the stories of vampires slain, of cursed keeps cleansed. She knew better, and she was right to be wary. The hunt begins. The Empire had left Schwarzburg behind, believing their work complete. The great fires had burned everything they could, and prayers to Sigmar had been spoken to purify the land. Yet, as Elsa walked through the ruined fortress, she felt it. Something was wrong. The air was thick with a presence. Something unseen but lingering, like a whisper in the dark, just beyond the reach of mortal ears. She had hunted vampires before. She had burned necromancers and purged the taint of chaos in villages from Wissenland to Stirland. But this was different. This was not finished. She stepped carefully through the ashen courtyard, her boots crunching over blackened bones and shattered steel. The Empire's soldiers had taken what they could, trophies, weapons, relics of war. But Elsa was not looking for silver or gold. She was looking for something far worse. A name in the dark. She reached the inner sanctum where the final battle had raged. Bloodstains still marked the stone. Sigurite prayers were etched into the walls, but none of it felt right. Her fingers traced the soot-stained floor where something had been burned, something more than just flesh and bone. The Empire had sought to destroy Gregor Von Drach completely. Yet, as Elsa ran her fingers over the blackened ground, she felt a chill run up her spine. The magic was still here, and then she saw it. A single rune carved into the floor, not in ink, nor in blood, but in the very essence of necromantic power itself. A ward, a symbol of binding, and beside it, barely visible beneath the layers of ash and ruin, a name had been carved into the stone, hastily, desperately, but undeniably. Adelheid. Elsa's eyes narrowed. The pale necromancer still lived. The oath. The wind howled through the broken halls as Elsa rose to her feet, her jaw clenched in fury. She had heard whispers of Adelheid the Pale before, but never thought the necromancer would be bold enough to act so openly. And yet, she had done more than simply defy the Empire. She had taken Gregor Von Drach, the undead captain of the von Karsteins, and tried to pull him beyond death itself. Had she succeeded, Elsa did not know, but she would find out. She knelt in the center of the ruin, her pistol resting upon the floor, her sword unsheathed, as she whispered the words she had spoken only once before, upon the day she took the sigil of the witch hunters. By Sigmar's light I swear it, by the fire that cleanses, by the stake that burns, by the silver that sears the flesh of the damned, I swear it. Her hand clenched into a fist over the rune, the ashes whirling around her like ghosts. I will hunt you, Adelheid the Pale. Her voice was steady, unwavering. I will find you, wherever you hide. She stood, cold determination settling into her bones. And I will end you. The Empire had declared the war over. But Elsa Varen knew the truth. The dead did not rest, and neither would she. Chapter 19. The Pale Sorceress. The night in Sylvania was always darker than anywhere else in the Empire. The forests twisted unnaturally, the very land pulsing with the remnants of ancient curses. No birds sang here, no wolves howled. Only the dead stirred beneath the earth, waiting. And through these forsaken lands, Adelheid the Pale walked alone. Her robes, once pristine white, were now tattered with age and travel. Her skeletal fingers clutched her staff, its twisted wood inscribed with necromantic runes that pulsed faintly in the moonlight. She moved like a phantom, her presence more shadow than substance, her mind focused on one goal alone. She sought the key to resurrection, not the crude necromancy of lesser sorcerers, the foul mockery of true life that bound weak souls to rotting flesh. No, she sought something greater, something that could defy even the pyres of the witch hunters, something that could restore Gregor Von Drach completely, not as a mindless revenant, not as a puppet of undeath, but as himself. And for that, she would need power beyond anything she had ever wielded. The tomb of the nameless king. Her journey took her to the heart of old Sylvania, where even the living feared to tread. There, beneath the crumbling remains of a long-forgotten fortress, lay the tomb of the nameless king, one of the oldest resting places of the dead, said to predate even the von Karstein's rule. Adelheid descended into the crypt, the air growing colder with each step. Her breath came out in mist, though her body no longer truly needed warmth. The walls pulsed with spectral energy, the stone itself breathing with the remnants of forgotten horrors. She had come here in search of one thing, the Black Chalice, an artifact older than Sylvania itself, said to bind the soul of the fallen and return them to true unlife. Legends whispered that it had been used once before, in an age before Sigmar's empire, when the first of the vampiric warlords had sought to defy even the lords of death themselves. The empire had long believed the chalice to be lost, buried deep beneath ruin and shadow. But Adelheid had learned the truth, and now she stood before it, the power to raise the dead. The Black Chalice rested upon an obsidian altar, its surface untouched by time. Dark runes covered its base, whispering secrets of necromantic power long forbidden. Adelheid stepped forward, her hands trembling for the first time in centuries. She had spent so long searching. She had failed Gregor once before. She would not fail him again. Carefully she lifted the chalice, feeling its cold, unnatural weight in her grasp. The moment her fingers touched its surface, the whispers in the crypt rose to a deafening chorus, spectral voices shrieking warnings, curses, demands. But Adelheid did not fear the dead. She had mastered them. Raising the chalice before her, she whispered the first incantation, a spell of binding, an oath made not to the gods, but to something far older. And in that moment, she knew Gregor Von Drach could return. Not as a specter, not as a revenant twisted by rage, but as he was before, as he was meant to be. If she had the time, if she had the power. Gathering the army of the dead, Adelheid left the tomb before dawn, the the black chalice hidden within her robes, its power thrumming like a second heartbeat. But the relic alone would not be enough. Gregor had been destroyed by Sigmarite fire. His very essence had been severed from this world. To restore him, she would need more than just magic. She would need an army. For the first time in centuries, Adelheid the Pale did not seek to hide in the shadows. She traveled to the scattered remnants of Sylvania's vampiric warlords, speaking in whispers of vengeance and retribution. She walked among the broken crypts, raising the old dead, binding them to her will. She sought out the outcasts, the hidden necromancers, those who still cursed the Empire's name. And one by one, they answered her call. In the ruins of an old watchtower, a cabal of dark sorcerers bent the knee. In the catacombs beneath the Black Hills, a legion of long-dead warriors stirred, their rusted swords clutched in skeletal hands. And in the forsaken villages where no light had shone in years, the ghouls crept forth from their burrows, sniffing the air, sensing war upon the wind. Adelheid stood upon a ruined balcony, overlooking the growing horde of the damned. The Empire had thought Schwarzburg's fall would be the end. They had believed that Gregor Von Drach had been erased. They had forgotten one thing: the dead do not stay buried. With the black chalice in hand, Adelheid whispered the words that would shake the old world to its core. Rise. And the dead obeyed. Chapter 20. The First Stirring of Vengeance. The ruins of Schwarzburg Keep lay in silent desolation. Where once the banners of the von Karsteins had flown, now there was only ash and broken stone. The Empire had done its work well. Every tower had crumbled, every crypt had been shattered, every trace of the fortress scoured from the earth by flame and faith. To the living, Schwarzburg was no more than a ruin, another victory in the Empire's long war against the undead. But the dead do not forget, and the dead do not forgive. The earth stirs. The moon hung heavy and red in the sky, Morsleb's sickly light casting strange shadows upon the blackened land. A wind rose, whispering through the ruins, stirring the scattered bones left behind in the battle. And then the ground trembled. A grave, long thought, undisturbed, lay hidden beneath the rubble, buried deep beneath layers of rock and cursed soil. It had been sealed by fire and faith, blessed by Sigmarite priests, consecrated with holy relics meant to ensure that nothing would ever rise from its depths. And yet, it shook again. The earth cracked. The Sigmarite wards etched into the stone flickered, their power weakening as something older, stronger, and far more patient than any priest's blessing began to awaken. Beneath the soil, something stirred, something that should not be. The return. The first crack appeared, splitting the dirt like an old wound reopening. Then another, and another, until at last, from the depths of the cursed grave, a hand broke through the surface. Not flesh, not bone. Something between. A gauntlet of blackened steel fused to flesh, long thought turned to ash. Fingers curled into a fist, the movement unnatural, yet filled with purpose. The hand twitched, then clawed forward, dragging itself from the grave inch by inch, as if refusing to be buried any longer. The ground gave way, and with it came something else. A shadow, neither fully living nor fully dead. A figure, armored and broken, yet filled with terrible purpose. A body that had once been burned away, now reforged, by power beyond the grave. Gregor Von Drach was not finished yet. A promise unfulfilled. The wind howled through the ruins, and for the first time since the siege of Schwarzburg, something moved among the rubble. A figure rose from the broken soil, his form still half cloaked in the earth, as if the grave itself had refused to hold him. His armor was ruined, his cloak tattered, but his eyes burned once more, not with the hunger of a revenant, nor the mindless rage of a wraith. but with remembrance. Gregor staggered forward, his first breath in what felt like eternity drawing in the cold night air of Sylvania. He looked down at his own hands, once steady, now shaking, yet filled with something new, something raw and unnatural. Not undeath, not life. Something between. He closed his fingers into a fist, feeling the strength return, feeling the weight of the past settle upon his shoulders. His mind was his own. His will was unbroken, and his oath remained. Gregor Von Drach turned his gaze to the horizon, to the lands of the Empire, to the men who had sought to erase him. He had bled for his count. He had fallen for his cause. And now he would rise for his vengeance. As the night deepened, the last trace of Gregor's grave was swallowed by shadow, the air thick with the promise of blood and war to come. He spoke only once, his voice a whisper in the wind, a promise to the dead and the living alike. The oath was sworn, and the debt remains unpaid.